Well, there's been a lot happening in the defence and national security space in recent weeks, so it's timely to have another conversation with Rear Admiral retired Rowan Moffitt, who was formerly Deputy Chief and Fleet Commander of the Royal Australian Navy. Some weeks ago, we spoke about the possible implications of the circumnavigation of Australia by a flotilla of China PLA Navy ships, and that led into a conversation about other aspects of Australia's national security and defence strategies. But there's been more happening in that space in recent weeks. So, Rowan, welcome to this conversation in economics, and looking forward to our discussion today. Perhaps we can start with the speech that US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth gave at the Shangri-La conference in Singapore a few weeks ago, where he kind of singled out what he described as the threat which China allegedly represented to the interests of Western nations, including Australia, and insisted in conversations with Australia's Defence Minister Richard Marles and in public that Australia needed to lift its defence spending to more than 3% of GDP. Now, I know, and we'll come back to your views about whether that's an appropriate way of calibrating Australia's defence spending, or indeed whether that's an appropriate starting point for considering how much we might need to spend on defence. But can I begin by getting you to reflect on the remarks that the US Defence Secretary made at this conference and what you think they mean for Australia's national security and defence strategies?
Yeah, certainly. And thanks, Saul. Good to be back to chat on these important things at this very pivotal time in Australia's history. And I think it is. I really do think it's a very pivotal time in our history. On Shangri-La generally, there were many interesting commentaries, and without going into great depth of detail, I think one of the ones that I'd commend anyone interested in chasing these things down, and it's available online, is a very short presentation speech, then a panel session with the Singaporean Minister for Defence, who I thought was incredibly impressive. And Singapore, of course, is a nation that we should pay some attention to in the sorts of things that they say and do, and it's really worth listening to what he had to say, amongst others. But that one in particular, I would call out. In respect of Secretary Hegseth, I thought he was particularly hairy-chested in his approach, and probably from the point of view of the United States, quite predictable in what he had to say, provocative and unnecessarily so, I think, and hairy-chested in a way which I think the administration itself doesn't seem to be thinking. And one of the reasons I say that is because there's a very interesting, without pushing anyone's barrow here, if you want to take a counter view, if you want to see things through a slightly more nuanced lens, and particularly from an Australian perspective, I would commend to you Hugh White's say, which is the current quarterly essay. It's people would say, oh, well, we know what Hugh thinks. Okay, well, maybe you do. But his analysis of what's going on at the moment is absolutely contemporary, and it's, in my view, extremely well argued, coherent, and logical.
Yeah, I'm
And
partway through that myself, so yes.
and so I'd commend it to anyone to read. I've got to know Hugh pretty well, and yes, I do know what he thinks about things, but he argues a very compelling case when he does argue for what he believes to be true. And what he's really saying, I think, draws a significant counterbalancing view to Secretary Hegseth's view, which was in many respects quite roundly thrashed, I think, from a number of points of view. I must say, listening to him, I thought it was lacking in logic and substance and connected up thinking. And Australia, frankly, I thought Prime Minister Albanese's response to it was, under the circumstances, quite appropriate.
There seemed to be a little difference between Richard Marles's response to Secretary Hegseth's speech and the Prime Minister's response to which you referred. My impression, and I obviously wasn't there, so I'm relying on press reports, is that Richard Marles appeared to endorse the calls that Secretary Hegseth made for Australia to spend a lot more on defence, whereas the Prime Minister's response was more sort of echoing John Howard in saying that Australia will decide how much it spends on defence and how it spends it, rather than being told how much to spend and what to spend it on by another country.
Yeah, and I'd agree with you. And then, of course, the explanations that have followed since tend to focus in on the nuance as well. That's not exactly what the Deputy Prime Minister meant. What he said was, look, we're up for a conversation. And that doesn't mean we're up for spending that amount of money. And I think the reality is, if you look back at the first term of the Albanese government, one of the things that has, I think, become reasonably clear is that whilst they might think that they have a will to spend more money on defence, they're probably in a situation where they don't feel that they, at the moment, that they have the wherewithal to
Mhm.
do that. And they might have some other concerns that I suspect you and I'll touch on in this conversation about what might be the outcome if they did spend more money
It-
on defence, and certainly appreciably more money, and what might not get funding to enable that to happen under the current arrangements of revenue raising that the government has.
Just before we get on to Australia's response in a little more detail, the Chinese representative at Shangri-La, who, if memory serves me correctly, was of lower status in the Chinese hierarchy than the defence minister or the person on the Politburo responsible for military affairs, and there may have been some point to that, but he gave the sort of response you would expect someone representing China to give. But was there any sense that you have of the response of other nations, including those in Asia to which Australia's traditionally been close, to what Secretary Hegseth said?
It's always interesting watching these things, particularly to see what it is that some of the other regional countries that are of great interest to us do actually say, and what level of representation they send along. I think, if you recall, Secretary Hegseth mentioned that China wasn't there, and that probably refers to the fact that they weren't a panelist. Were they invited? Well, we don't know. I don't know. But certainly they were present in the room. And yes, you're right, that the couple of people I saw ask questions were certainly of a relatively junior role in the big firmament of life in the Chinese Communist Party. And what they really were saying, I think, was pretty safe territory and quite predictable, without just letting it all go through to the keeper
Mhm.
unchallenged at all. So I think one of the values of sitting through these things, and I haven't watched the videos of all of them, only a few, is to see what some of the regional players do say, because I think that they have a great deal to offer in terms of models that we might consider for our own behaviour going forward, especially taken in the context of the sort of strategic evolving circumstances that Hugh White points to, which, as I say, is compelling reading, I think. I wouldn't want to pick any particular ones, but I now am not fresh in my memory with the Minister for Defence in Singapore exactly what he said, but there were some really good little takeaways. And that's the case with our regional neighbours. We should be paying more attention to them, in my view, to what they say, what they think, and increasingly, I think, as the whole US posture unfolds and the world changes in spite of the US rhetoric of people like Hegseth, that we need to be spending, as Hugh suggests, a great deal more time thinking about what this actually all means for us in a world which is fundamentally different
Yeah.
and is not going to be the way it used to be.
I think another more recent reminder of how the world isn't going to be as it used to be was the recent, I'm not sure whether incursions is the right word, but of two Chinese aircraft carriers, the Liaoning and the Shandong, into the East China Sea, which seems to have been another demonstration of the PLA Navy's growing capabilities. So what did you read into that?
I would go back to, I think, what I said before. This is what they consider to be their patch, the area of the world over which they seek to exert influence as the dominant great power, and they will continue to do those and more expansionist types of activities, more adventurous types of activities to help develop their own capabilities. Operating two carriers together is, having been at sea trying to do that with the very experienced US aircraft carriers, it is a significant challenge of integration, automation, command and control, and collision avoidance. When you've got that many aircraft operating off two ships in relatively close confines, it's a challenging thing to do that takes a lot of practice. So I'm not surprised they're doing it. I'm not troubled by the fact they're doing it. I think it's completely predictable that they would do these sorts of things, and we will see much more of it, and we will see it much further afield.
Did it tell us anything we didn't know, or it confirmed things we suspected?
I think perhaps the only thing it may have told us that we should have been prepared for was that like everything else that the Chinese do, they they get to do it a whole lot quicker than we forecast they would.
Well, that all sets the scene for what Australia needs to be thinking about in this, as you say, rapidly changing and evolving world and geostrategic environment. So if we can come back to Australia and its national security and defence strategies, clearly the Americans are saying to us that they want us to spend more on defence, and they're putting a figure as a percentage of GDP. Perhaps it might be useful here just for you to recapitulate why you think that's a bad way of thinking about what Australia needs to do in the defence space.